I'm doing well. Okay. I guess I am live. Just hang tight, folks, while I get set up with everything. Shouldn't be very long. Go. I really need Brian and his jangling keys for this, or at least music. Yeah, something to look into now that I have my own space again. Oh God, that's so nice. Okay. Hey Teresa, welcome back. Long time no see. From the last uh, stream. So DVDR posting, personal feed posting, and Paranormal Encyclopedia posting. Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, or if you're joining us from my previous rant, welcome back. This is Kevin Mears, your host. Kevin, the Paranormal Encyclopedia Paranormal investigator and demonologist. And I'm here to talk to you about the Salem witch trials and things I've discovered recently that you might not know. Um, if you know these things, my bad. I found them new and surprising, and I thought they were worth talking about. Now, a lot of what I grew up being told or reading about the Salem witch trials, I've recently discovered is actually quite untrue. If you're wondering about sources, I actually have been reading the original trial transcripts, which are available both online and in print format. I got a print format because I'm old and I prefer physical copies. I've also been reading King James I's Demonology. Um, I'm currently reading The Wonders of the Invisible World, which is a book that Con Mather, who was a Puritan preacher, wrote about the trials. He was very much in favor of them. Um, and Amalius Maleficarum, which is the Catholic handbook on witch hunting, written, I want to say, the 14th century by Kramer and Springer. Those would be my sources. Along with, there's an excellent book, Storm of Witchcraft, that was written quite recently. I don't know by whom. Um, but I want to start off with probably the figure that I have since discovered we must understand from the trials, which is Tituba. So three women were initially accused of witchcraft, just about simultaneously, and the Tituba is generally the first. A slave by the name of Tituba, a woman by the name of Sarah Good, and another woman by the name of Sarah Osborne. Um, now, most people know from the play and the various movie adaptations of it, at least one, I think two, um, The Crucible, about Tituba, that she was African American slave of Samuel Parris, the Reverend of the colony of Salem, who was teaching the children fortune telling and voodoo dances in the forest. Um, this is the commonly accepted story, and everything I just said is false. Literally every single thing. She was an African. She did not practice. I find no evidence that she practiced voodoo at all. Um, there's no evidence of her teaching the children to dance in the woods or anything of that nature. And using the egg to tell the future is really interesting, but she didn't do that either. But we'll circle back to that. So let's start with where she's from. The records of the time and the most historians since actually think she was a member of the Carib tribe, which is a tribe native to South America. Particularly in her case, she would have been. We know that Reverend Paris picked her up in Barbados. Um, the Carib tribe is native to Barbados, and while people tend to think of slavery as all black people, the reality is, well, a massively disproportionate number of slaves in the colonies were black. Not all of them were, particularly Native Americans and various tribal groups were popular choices. One of the biggest hints that she was actually a Native American, not a slave would be her husband. Her husband, who actually is one of the people who made accusations, was named John Indian. He also likely was a member of the Cree tribe. Now, the voodoo thing, Teresa points out that the voodoo thing was definitely news. Sure, it was news to me too in a lot of ways. Um, Being a member of the Cree tribe, it's not real likely she would have practiced voodoo. Um, she may have been part of whatever natural religion they practice. I honestly am not that familiar with their religious practices to comment on that. But there's no record reading her actual confession, because right in her first questioning she confesses to worshiping Satan. Nothing in it resembles voodoo. She doesn't talk about teaching the children how to dance. She doesn't, or to perform various rituals out in the woods, like is popularly thought. She doesn't talk about looking into this whole idea that they crack an egg into a glass and then look into the yolk and see the future. She doesn't talk about that. She talks about flying around on a broomstick. She talks about cursing people. She talks about the same generic witch practices you see in everyone else who confessed to witchcraft. There's really, as far as I can tell, I may be wrong, there's really no good evidence to suggest she was actually practicing any kind of magic except for one thing. We do know, as a matter of record, that when the girls were first afflicted, Betty Paris and her cousin, I want to say, she prepared what's known as a witch cake. A witch cake was a home remedy for witchcraft. It involved urine, menstrual blood, and a bunch of other fairly icky components that you would eat and supposedly could break the curse. Um, but that wasn't really an inherently voodoo practice. It was fairly common in the colonies. Um, but that's the closest thing we have to any record of her practicing magic. And here's the interesting thing about that: there is evidence that at least some of the people accused may have been practicing what the Puritans would have called witchcraft. Um, Not that they were actually worshiping the devil or cursing, or to some extent cursing people, but the Puritans had a very dim view of anything related to the paranormal or supernatural. Um, there's evidence of one, and I'd have to go through a lot of notes to remember, but there's no evidence that one of the women was actually practicing palm reading. Not really a way of cursing anyone, but the Puritans still saw it as satanic and evil. We know that there are reports from the Puritans, so they're not terribly reliable per se, but it's not unlikely that they found puppets. If you don't know what a puppet is what you think is voodoo doll is. In voodoo and African religion, dolls aren't generally used to curse people. They're actually used to help people. Um, the voodoo doll, as we think of it, is actually taken from European witchcraft. Certainly, hoodoo, which is the magic that people confuse with voodoo. Voodoo is actually religion, which is a whole other video, and I've done videos on it. Does make use of puppets and sometimes uses them to curse people, but they took that from Europe. It isn't an originally African idea. But there are reports of those being found in the homes of some of the accused, particularly what's his name, John Proctor. Another real common one that I think is probably true, that they've even found archaeological evidence of recently, is a horseshoe or a pitchfork nailed above the door, both of which were traditional ways of warding off witches. Again, trying to ward off a witch doesn't sound like witchcraft to most people, but to the Puritans, it was witchcraft. Because anything remotely related to the supernatural that wasn't prayer to God was basically witchcraft, in their opinion. Then there's another interesting related thing. So the fortune telling through eggs. Yes, that actually happened. Um, or at least as far as we can tell, it happened. Sources from the time period talk about it, and there's really no good reason to think it didn't happen. The question is, did Tituba teach them how to do it? Again, in none of the trial transcripts relating to her is this ever brought up. Don't take my word for it, you can look them up yourself. But what we do know is that it was a very popular game among children in the New England colonies in the 17th century. It was kind of the From what I understand, from what I've read, it was kind of the 17th century version of playing Bloody Mary as a sleepover. The parents forbade it. The preachers called it the work of the devil. The kids did it anyway. Probably, let's be honest, some of the kids did it because their parents told them not to, because rebellion is not a new idea among teenagers. Um, as to all of the implications about the seeing the coffin, I'm less certain, but yeah, they did. The girls did look into it. This actually ties into another thing I found really surprising. When we talk about the Salem witch trials, at least whenever I hear people talk about them, they tend to think of a bunch of young girls accusing a bunch of old women. What surprised me is actually a lot of the ones making the accusations were teenagers. And I don't mean like 13, 14. I mean 16, 17. Some of them were married, several of them were married, some of them were actually in their 20s or 30s. At least one or two of them were old enough that the records called them refer to them as spinsters. They weren't these they weren't these helpless young girls, is what I'm getting at. They were some of them were, certainly, but most of them were actually past the age of puberty. They were teenagers. They were adults in many cases, making these accusations. Um, which leads to another really interesting question, which is what caused which is actually, I should say, the central question I'm trying to address with the book I'm working on, is what caused the hysterical fits? And no one really knows is the answer. The two most common explanations I've seen are either ergot poisoning or mass psychogenic illness. Mass psychogenic illness is a fancy term for mass hysteria. I'll circle back to that in a second. Let me address the ergot poisoning idea. Ergot poisoning isn't consistent with described symptoms. For one, a very common symptom of ergot poisoning that never gets described: severe diarrhea. Also, if it was over as prolonged a period of time as the trials would suggest, the symptoms would have become permanent. They would have suffered hallucinations the rest of their lives, and we don't have the records to support that. Ergot poisoning doesn't fit the facts. Mass psychogenic illness, mass hysteria, is a much better explanation. Um, you, there's a problem there as well, though. As I just finished explaining, the girls in question were often teenagers or adults. Mass psychogenic illness are usually in very tightly knit um, social groups. Like it's been observed in, and I don't mean to disparage anyone here, but it's been commonly observed in cheerleaders in high schools, where one of them gets this idea that they have an illness or disease, and all of a sudden they all start acting the same way, or they get these ideas and these notions, and they spread, and people will actually show physical symptoms of diseases they don't have as a group. But it has to do with social networks and way that they reinforce each other, and I don't think there's good evidence for that going on here either. That Another interesting thing I think worth talking about is how many people died, because people get that wrong as well. So 19 people were hanged. No, and to be clear, and this is probably one, Teresa, I'm sure you know this, and most of my other listeners will know this. To be clear, no one was burned at the stake in anywhere in the U.S. In the American colonies. Didn't happen. Didn't happen in England either. Under English law, witchcraft was punished by hanging because it was seen as a crime against the state. Most often, actually, it was seen as I cursed you and you died, so now I'm on trial for murder by witchcraft, but still murder. Um, in much of the rest of Europe, it was seen as a religious crime, a form of heresy or apostasy, and that's why they were burned at the stake. And even then, in the majority of cases of execution, people were strangled, had their heads cut off, drawn and quartered, drowned, and then the dead body was burned. It absolutely happened. Do not misunderstand me. But people were burned alive for the crime of witchcraft in Europe. But more often, they were executed and the dead body was burned to prevent the body from returning from the dead. It is not a case of, oh, they were burning people alive, everyone alive. Okay, here we go. Some of my notes. So, of the three people that were accused, only three of them were really children. Elizabeth Betty Paris was 9, Abigail Williams was 12, and Ann Putnam Jr. was also 12. Those were in their teens or even older. Bathsheba the Pope was 39. John Indian, who, as I've already said, is the husband of Tituba, was 31. They weren't confused little girls being manipulated by adults. They were teenagers and adults in their own right. Another common thing, looking at the list, and I started working on writing the book, although I haven't done much of that. I started making a list. Despite what people think, not everyone who was accused of witchcraft was found guilty. Nehemiah Abbott was accused of witchcraft, and then when not enough of the accusers could agree that he was the one afflicting them, some said, yeah, it's him. Some said, it looks like him. I'm not sure. Some of them just outright said, no, he was actually released. The three slaves that were accused of witchcraft, Tituba, Candy, and Mary Black, were held but never even put on trial, let alone convicted. And a few individuals actually managed to flee and escape the whole matter entirely. Also worth noting, not all of the people that were executed were women. Yes, the majority of people executed in Salem were women. But so 4 men were hanged. Giles Corey, of course, was crushed to death. Oh, that's one of the other myths I want to get into. And then a man by the name of Roger Toothaker would die in prison. Giles Corey is also a really interesting case. He was crushed to death. Most people believe it was for doing what's called standing silent. So in a court of law, if when you're indicted, I want to say, I'm not a lawyer, but when you're indicted, you're asked, "What is your plea? Innocent, guilty or not guilty?" Standing silent is when you refuse to give an answer. Most people think that's what was going on with Giles Corey. Historians are actually not sure. The most common explanation that's given for why he stood silent is because if you plead guilty to witchcraft, your lands are forfeit to the state. If you plead not guilty, you're found guilty and your lands are forfeit to the state. It's actually not true. Well, the lands thing is very iffy under Salem law. On the other hand, physical property, like if you own a ring, that was certainly seized by the constable. So one way or the other, whatever way he pled, he would have been in the same position in terms of his property. What historians now seem to think is that what he actually did is refuse to stand trial. And in point of fact, it's very questionable if he had changed his mind, if they would have stopped torturing him. We also don't know even how long he was pressed to death. We know that he was laid on the ground and more rocks were added to him until his chest caved in. It may have taken hours. It may have taken days. The records aren't real clear. Looking at the people that here's something else I found really interesting. A lot of people have this idea that all of it was tragedy. Everyone who was accused was innocent. This is actually up for debate. Certainly, I'm not claiming that anyone who was accused of witchcraft was guilty of the crime of witchcraft as Puritans understood it. But if you read several of the trial transcripts, particularly the records regarding, what is his name? One second. George Burroughs, who was the only Puritan, I might add, pastor who was executed for witchcraft. Lisa for Truth, hey, wonderful to see you. So if you read the records about Burroughs, I don't think he was guilty of witchcraft. Probably. But there's some evidence to suggest that he was a wife beater. Um, Certainly, he's accused of beating two of his. He'd had three wives at the time, two of which had died. He was accused of beating the first two to death, um, which actually the evidence of that is extremely suspect because basically the girls claimed that the spirits of his dead wives came to them and told them that he had murdered them. And that's another thing that surprised me. The Puritans actually did, despite the way that most modern Protestant, many or at least many modern Protestants see things, they did actually believe in ghosts. They believed that spirits of dead people came back. And there's references to it all over the trial records. I I think there's at least a possibility. And at this point, it's been what 400 years. Yeah, 1992 would have made 400 years. So 400 years since um, George was hanged for witchcraft. Um, so there's no way to know for sure, but I think there's at least a possibility that there's the reality of 17th century society, and it was a way for the truth to get out about certain things. That said, the situation for women wasn't entirely as bad as I would have even thought it was in Salem. For example, Puritans considered the question of marriage a civil issue, not a religious issue. So divorce was entirely legal because that was a matter for the courts to decide. The church didn't get involved. Um, I thought that was actually rather surprising when I read that, but apparently, yeah, it's true. There's another myth actually related to all of this I want to touch on as well. Where am I on time? Okay, I want to probably wrap this up soon, but there's something else I want to address because this is another common misconception about witch trials both in Salem and around the world. And fun bonus fact for you that I hadn't known: there were 14 trials for witchcraft in the colonies before Salem, many in Connecticut, and people were executed. Reverend John Hale, who was probably the most famous of the preachers who was in favor of the witch trials, though he later turned around on that, actually witnessed one of the other witch trials as a boy, um, and is thought to have tied into why he believed in witches at the time. But and that's another thing. There's another thing there worth talking about. But there's this idea that of the burning times, that the witch trials were about suppressing paganism, either in Europe or in Salem or both. Um, it's not true. Historically, I mean, again, going through the records, certainly they're not describing anything resembling modern Wicca or modern neo-paganism. Um, Mostly what they're describing is fantasies, fantasies that are a result of priests who aren't allowed to marry, who get some really funny ideas about women late at night. For an example of some of the crazy things people believed, the Kramer, the Malleus Maleficarum, actually claims, and absolutely love this. And my friend Patrick Thomas, when he was on the other week, suggested this is a funny idea for a short story. But witches would steal men's penises and keep them as pets. So Patrick suggested the idea of a story where witch hunters come to take the witch, and their own penises come to attack them, which is a great idea for fiction. But let's face it, the idea that it actually happened is ludicrous, but people seriously believed it. Although, in fairness, there's a thing there. One of the most common things that's rightly criticized about trials is the use of what's called spectral evidence. It was believed that these afflicted people would see the spirit of the person attack them, and that was considered very strong evidence. And there's a huge debate even at the time, but generally the idea was the devil can't take your appearance, because the one point that even Con Mather, who was a fan of the Salem witch trials and did support at least some of the spectral evidence made, is he thought the devil was perfectly could appear as an angel of light. He can appear as a human being, even one that's service to God. But the general feeling among among the judges in particular seems to have been that you cannot Satan can only take your appearance with your consent. So even if it was the devil appearing as the person instead of the person leaving their body, the person's still a witch. And Lisa, I absolutely agree that the stealing penises thing does sound more like men with a preoccupation with sex. Like I said, I think that's the end result of a couple of Catholic priests and Dominican monks at that, sitting up in the monasteries at night, not allowed to touch, think about, or look at women, getting some really funny ideas about sex and what women do. It's ludicrous, but it does sound like, yeah, it's people that have a preoccupation with sex. Particularly, it's men who have a preoccupation with the sex they're not allowed to have. Um, but no, there's no evidence that what's going on is pagan practice. The reality of it is, while there's a real mystery about what caused the seizures in the children, the best evidence suggests that the reason why the trials succeeded the way they did is a combination of political pressures that would actually a lot of the political pressures that would ultimately spill over less than a century later into the Revolutionary War start back then. Tensions because of the recent war that had been fought with the Native Americans called King Philip's War that doesn't get very much attention but really should. I believe Aton Shea film has a video about that. I haven't seen the video in question, but Aton Shea is an excellent YouTube channel. I highly recommend checking him out. But there have been wars with the Native Americans. There were economic issues. There was a conflict between Salem proper and the surrounding farms because Salem itself wanted pretty much everyone to come to their church. The outlying farms felt they deserved their own church, and there's all sorts of land disputes. It's pretty well known the economic, political, and social tensions that caused the trials. And well, certainly the Puritans. And okay, side note: there's this idea that the Pilgrims and Puritans came to the New World fleeing religious persecution. It's not actually true. Particularly in the case of the Pilgrims, they didn't come. They didn't just fly straight to the New World because they were being persecuted in England. They were being mistreated, but the Pilgrims went to Holland first, Amsterdam, and were treated very well because at the time the Dutch were famous for their religious tolerance. They didn't care what you did as long as you obeyed the laws, basically. That's what bothered the Pilgrims and why they came to the United States. Were offended by the idea of religious freedom. So they came to the United States, and the Puritans very much came to the United States because they wanted the freedom to enforce their religion on other people. You can tell this because we actually have records of Baptists and Quakers being executed by these people for the crime of being the wrong kind of Christian. It wasn't. I don't think it was about any form of paganism. The evidence just isn't there. Um, which of course leads to the question of what I do think it's about. And I could be cheap and say you got to wait for the book for that, but that's a little ways off. And I don't mind sharing a little bit of my thoughts. But I think there were actually, believe it or not, I think there may actually have been witches in Salem. And when I say witches, I mean witches in the sense the Puritans thought of witches, people that actually knowingly, willingly worshiped the devil. Where I disagree with the Puritans is I don't think the people accused were the ones practicing witchcraft. If you go to Sarah Osborne, remember, Sarah is one of the first 3 women accused of witchcraft, and read her the first time she was questioned. And you can't get too much further than that, unfortunately, because she died in prison relatively early on. She not only denies being a witch, she claims to be the victim of witches and proceeds to describe what psychologists would call sleep paralysis. And at the time would likely have been known as an incubus attack because she's a woman, or a hagging. And littered throughout testimonies, both from the witches and the people that made the accusations, are suggestions that somebody is actually, whether you believe magic works or not, there are certainly people that believe that magic works, and there's certainly people in time that believe that magic, but that somebody in the colony is in fact practicing magic, and not just the gray area stuff I was talking about the pitchforks and the horseshoes, but using puppets to try to curse people and things of that nature. But that person was either one of the accusers or manipulating the accusers. Um, Certainly, we know for certain that the trials were very much used for political gains. For example, Tituba would later say to a man writing one of the first skeptical books on the Salem witch trials, a book called More Wonders of the Invisible World, which is on my reading list. Why this is going as slowly as it does is it's really painful trying to read 17th century English. It's so much like modern English, but not quite. It drives you batty. Trust me if you haven't done. Um, a good comparison that many of you may be familiar with if you haven't tried to read any of the witch transcripts, it's like trying to read Chaucer in the original Chaucer, um, or Shakespeare. The fact you kind of got to wrap your head around the language a little because it's English, but particularly the problem I have with it is that they can't agree on the spelling of anything. Occasionally, they'll spell the same word differently in the same document because this is all before English was a standardized in spelling and all of that nature. Not that it's all that standardized now. Um, but I've got a bunch more to read. This is just what I've discovered so far. Um, I've already gotten much longer than I intended because I wanted to try to start making these shorter. Lisa, if you did not see the first stream I did today, I want to again personally apologize for missing the interview that I was supposed to have with you. I also have the transcripts. If you would like input, please feel free to ask. If you've missed me saying in the past, I'm actually working on researching to write a book about the Salem trials. Inspired a year ago when I actually went to Salem. Advantage of being in New Jersey, it's not that far to go up there. Teresa, we can work that out. And thank you. She says she wants an autographed book. And Lisa, I very much appreciate you understanding that I was sick, but you still have a wonderful channel, and I regret not taking the chance to be part of it. If you want to have me back, if you want to offer me another invite, I am more than happy to come back. You are also welcome to come on my channel if you would like. That goes both ways as far as I'm concerned. Let's see what. I feel like there was one other thing I was going to mention about I found out about Salem. And I thought, this isn't so much a question of things I didn't know, but things I found really amusing because it's a question that occurred to me. So it was believed, and it comes up repeatedly in trial records, that all a witch had to do was look at you, and she could send you into this fit, strike you down so that it felt like somebody was on top of you, choking you to death. So the obvious question that occurs to me is, if they have this power, why don't they, when they're sitting in jail, they wait for the guards to open the jail door, choke the guards, and walk out to freedom? Or do it with the judges? Or do it when the constable shows up to arrest them? Seems like a really obvious solution, don't you? It's like, I could strike you down and nearly kill you just by looking at you. Why am I going to let you arrest them? I found an answer to this, actually, in King James I's book, Demonology. And the answer makes even less sense in context. So James suggests that when a witch is arrested by lawful authority who is trying her lawfully, she loses her power. So this would explain neatly why she couldn't just strike the guards down and walk out of jail. The problem is, if that's the case, why could she strike the victims down in court? It doesn't make any sense. It works the one time, it doesn't work the other. I mean, the whole thing's ridiculous. I mean, the whole idea that of spectral evidence of putting so much weight on they saw the spirit of the person was condemned even during the witch trials. Con Mather, who very much was witches are real, hang 'em kind of guy, wrote and said that about the fact that he didn't think they should rely so heavily on spectral evidence. I have to say as well, reading more about him over time, Cotton Mather's a really interesting guy. Um, Screwball in the fact that he totally supported the Salem witch trials, but very well intelligent, Harvard educated, just like his father Increase. Very respected. Benjamin Franklin actually wrote that when he was young, he was very much inspired by an essay on ethics that Cotton had written. There's also a very funny story of Benjamin going to visit Cotton and visiting Cotton's library, and after they have a long discussion, Ben turns to leave, and Cotton says, "Stoop, stoop," and Ben's confused and starts to turn around. Keeps walking, starts to around, and bangs his head into one of the ceiling beams because he thought Cotton was saying "stop" when he actually meant "stoop," as in bend down. You're about to hit the ceiling. Um, and then Cotton gives him a bit of advice about basically amounts to watch where you're going. Lisa for Truth asks, wasn't James the First the one who believed in witches because of the storm that waylaid his bride Anne of Denmark? Um, I believe that's correct. He certainly believed he was obsessed with witchcraft. Enough to have written, I want to say, two books on the subject, actually. Demonology is mostly about witchcraft, although it also talks about, as you might expect, demons and even touches briefly on vampires and werewolves, believe it or not. But he had a big thing about witchcraft, and I'd have to look it up to be certain. But that story about his wife does sound accurate to me. Um, no, his books are really interesting read. Um, I would not advocate the truth of any of it, but I know one of the I found it very interesting that he makes a distinction between witchcraft and necromancy. Um, in which he sees witchcraft as motivated for revenge and necromancy to be formal ritualized magic um, to summon demons specific, and usually um, science out of hand essentially would be what motivates it. It's usually he saw it as academics would get into necromancy because they'd study astronomy, they'd study astrology, they'd study alchemy, and then they'd just get curious about the other, the forbidden workings of the world and get into summoning and trying to control demons. Where witches usually got into it for revenge. They wanted to hurt somebody. Lo and behold, James also thought that witches were mostly women. Uh, not exclusively, nor did the Puritans think they were exclusively women. In fact, fun fact: while it's absolutely true that most of Europe, most of the world, really, the majority of people executed or accused of witchcraft are women. It's not universally true. In both Scandinavia and Russia, the vast majority of people accused of witchcraft were actually men. And in Scandinavia in particular, their superstitions at the time believed that only men could be witches. So the idea of a female witch was ridiculous to them. Doesn't really relate to Salem, but I thought it was interesting. Um, but that's kind of where I am with my Salem research. It's absolutely fascinating. I am working on bringing more episodes. I would expect. I think Saturdays and Sundays are the good days for me at this point. I'm off entirely on Saturdays, and I don't work till overnight on Sundays, so I have a lot of time. But I'm going to start doing weekly episodes again. Like I said, I'm currently talking to Reverend Ed Trevors, who is another YouTuber. If you do not know him, I highly recommend him. Um, Particularly for non-Christians, just because he is such a compassionate, decent human being. And we have a lot of very similar views on transgender rights and LGBT rights in general, and on abortion. And I mean, this is a man of the cloth. He does videos in the Roman color, and he talks about why he thinks that overturning Roe versus Wade was a mistake, not just from an ethical standpoint of legal abortion, but it was a mistake even for the Christians that wanted it overturned because of the nature of religion and government, and making a really interesting argument that I'm not going to try and do justice to here, of this actually having more to do with the beast of the Book of Revelations than actual Christianity, because of this idea of government control and government enforced religion. Like I said, check him out. Great guy. I don't know if for sure he'll come on. We're still talking about it. If Reverend Travers, if you see this, please give serious thought. I would love to have you on. You are such a guiding light. I've been really stressed out with the decisions the Supreme Court's made recently, just because I'm worried about where this is going. And watching his videos has been a huge comfort for me personally, just to hear this clearly deeply religious man speak so compassionately and so in favor of things that I absolutely support. But that's going to do it for tonight, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank you all so much for joining me. Teresa and Lisa, it's so great to see you both again. Thank you for coming back. I've missed you both in this extended hiatus I have been on, but I am back for certain. We'll be doing more videos again. I hope you join us. Until next time, I want to say to everyone watching this, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. If you enjoy what I do, if you want to support what I'm doing, please give me a like, leave a comment. Heck, if you don't like what I'm doing, leave me a thumbs down and tell me I'm an idiot. Because if you didn't know, either way helps me in the algorithm. Um, if you really support what I'm doing, you can always consider going to my Patreon. Links in the description. If you don't have the money, times are tough. I get it. If you don't support me that much, I get it too. Watch it, like, comment, subscribe, share it with your friends. Maybe all help me out and don't cost you a penny. And I appreciate anything you do like of that sort. That's it for tonight. This is Kevin Mears, demonologist and paranormal encyclopedia, saying good night and God bless everybody.